Hey guys, it's Alex. You've been asking a lot of great questions in the comments section for pretty much every one of my videos about sound for film and TV and online distribution, podcasting, everything. And I thought there were a bunch of questions that really touched on some interesting subject matter, and I wanted to discuss those a little bit further. So the first question is, in terms of getting broadcast sound for podcast audio, the kind of boomy radio voice that you might expect, do you really need something like an SM7B with a really intense audio interface, or can you make do with something a little bit less expensive? And one of you guys commented back that in terms of the broadcast sound, it's mostly due to the proximity effect, and basically you just bring the mic closer to the speaker's mouth, and the type of mic and the type of audio interface don't really matter that much. Now, there are a couple of things here. The proximity effect that Tanner mentioned, that is what it's called when you get that kind of nice boomy broadcast sound. You've got a microphone that is sensitive to low-end frequencies, real close to a speaker's mouth, and that's a specific principle of directional microphones that occurs with. So mic choice actually does kind of matter, because omnidirectional mics, you won't get as pronounced an effect as you do with something like a cardioid mic. There are a huge variety of microphones out there that you can get great sound quality out of without necessarily spending as much as the SM7B, for example, which is about $350, $400. I mean, there are plenty of cardioid microphones that will work just fine. However, those mics, the SM7B and the other one is the Electrovoice RE20, those mics are chosen because they require the least amount of work after the fact to get them sounding the way that you'd expect the broadcast voice too. Both of them share a lot of similar characteristics. The RE20 is actually intended to be a kick drum mic, but by putting this thing right up against somebody's mouth, it's designed to kind of reject the blowback of kick drum wind, and it's also designed to kind of emphasize low frequency information. It's also a dynamic microphone, so it doesn't have as pronounced a top end response, and when you bring that mic really, really close to somebody's voice, you don't get all the crazy sibilant harshness that you might out of some cardioid condenser microphones that are more sensitive to high end. So by selecting those microphones or ones with similar characteristics, you're actually kind of matching the microphone with its intended goal down the line, rather than just getting something that's going to pick up sound. And the reason I wanted to touch on this is because that is how I approach every recording that I do. It's less about just slapping some really high-end microphone on something and saying, oh yeah, it's going to sound great. It's more, what is the intended purpose of the recording I'm going to capture in the eventual product that I'm going to use it in? And of course, you don't necessarily know what exact purpose every recording that you're going to make is going to serve eventually, but the human voice, at the very least, is relatively straightforward, and most sound effects that are recorded that are intended to sort of play as is without being designed or manipulated heavily, you can get great stuff without having to spend exorbitant amounts of money on gear. And that kind of leads me to the next question from one of you guys, which is, I decided to sell my Sound Devices Mix Pre 6 and get the Zoom F6. Was that a mistake, or are they kind of the same quality? I wanted the 32-bit float technology. I haven't really been shy about mentioning in my videos that I'm not a huge proponent of Zoom's gear. I've had a lot of experience with the H series, the 4, the 5, and the 6. I personally don't really like them. Their preamps aren't clean enough or quiet enough for the recordings that I'm making, but a lot of the stuff that I'm doing requires really quiet, clean pre's because I'm capturing like ambiances and very quiet sounds. Whereas if you're trying to capture something that's a little bit louder than the noise floor of the recorder, so you don't have to crank the pre's as much, like the human voice, kind of how I'm talking right now, or cars or planes, something like that. I used an F8 to record a Falcon 9 rocket launching from Vandenberg Air Force Base, and it did totally fine. I found that Sound Devices gear from the Mix Pre series all the way up through the 788T has performed a little bit better for my needs. They're quieter preamps, they're a little bit cleaner, they're a little more transparent to my ears, and that comes at a price. I mean, they're not cheap recorders by any means, but the point that I want to make with this is that you can still get great results out of stuff that's not necessarily the top-end, most expensive sort of thing. So to answer the question, no, I don't think you made a mistake. I think you got exactly what you need, and I'm personally more curious about what microphone you're using, not necessarily your recorder, because for 80% of their uses, pretty much any recorder at this point is going to be good. The other thing this question mentioned is 32-bit floating point operation. Now, real quick, Sound Devices with their Mix Pre 2 series just introduced 32-bit floating point, so if you already know what it is and that's what you're looking for, they've got it. They're offering the same capabilities as Zoom. I think that's great. But I wanted to use this as an excuse to talk about audio resolution, bit depth, and sample rate, because those are all kind of important components that I think deserve a little bit more attention than they usually get, because let's be honest, they're boring subjects. But that is really important once you start working with broadcast television or theatrical feature films or even distributing on Netflix and Amazon. They all have these specifications for audio that demand you have to have this bit depth and this sample rate and this file format and whatever else. Industry standard specifications in audio for video, you've got a bit depth of 24 bits and a sample rate of 48 kilohertz. And if you're not doing too much, you're working mainly with picture and you just kind of want to get audio a little bit better, you can kind of leave it at that. As long as whatever you're recording is 24-bit, 48K, you're going to be good. If you want to get a little bit deeper into it, recording at higher sample rates allows you to get a lot more kind of playroom when you're pitching or time stretching or manipulating your audio after the fact. If you ever see or make recordings that are at 96 kilohertz or 192 kilohertz or even beyond, you can pitch stretch and time stretch those things way further after the fact than you would be able to do with just a standard 48 kilohertz file. The same thing would happen with lower frame rates and higher frame rates in the camera world. If you shoot something at 23976 and you try and make it play back at 120 frames per second, it's gonna look bad. Whereas if you shoot 120 frames per second and you try and make it look like it's 23976, that'll translate much better. It's always easier to subtract existing information or frames or audio content than it is to add it back and rely on the computer to do it correctly. And bit depth, while it's not quite an exact match with the analogy, is kind of related to something like the exposure slider in Lightroom. If you're working with raw footage or raw files, you can push the exposure way, way up and your computer will still be able to kind of make everything visible and do a lot more with a raw photo than if you had something like a JPEG and you tried to do the same thing. Bit depth is kind of similar because it allows your computer that much more processing room to push files louder or manipulate things in different ways. It also adds a huge amount of headroom above and beyond 24-bit, just allowing your computer or your recorder to accurately process and avoid clipping really loud files. And I know that doesn't sound quite as important as, say, picking the right microphone or getting the right monitors or, doing actual sound editorial stuff. 32-bit gives you a hell of a lot more playroom in pushing those files than 24-bit did. And speaking of monitors and speakers in general, a lot of you have been asking about what kind of speakers I've been using and what you might find in sort of industry standard setups. That touches on the idea of translation between what you hear in your space and what everybody else is going to hear once your content is released. And that is the most important thing about audio mixing, is making sure that those things match up as closely as possible. I can tell you that the speakers that I'm using are Genelec 8030s, and I chose these because they are as transparent and unflattering to sound as possible. If something sounds even the slightest bit not good in my recordings, these speakers showcase it like it's the worst thing in the world, and it makes me want to give up and go home. These are like abusive speakers. But by the same token, if I can get something sounding really good on these speakers, I know it's probably going to translate pretty well elsewhere, because not many other speakers are as revealing as something like these. Some of the other standards I've seen around kind of bigger name major studio facilities in terms of post-production audio, people are using JBL 6328s and sometimes even the 4328s. They're also using the new JBL 7 series, like the 705s, the 708s. Those actually translate really well to larger dub stages. And those big stages themselves tend to go with things like Meyer. That's kind of getting into a whole other world of like the brands like PMC or ATC, where it's $15,000 or $20,000 per speaker. That's kind of a whole other realm. But again, the important thing here is translation and finding gear that's going to make your mixes more clear to your ears and translate better to other systems, so that when people go and watch your stuff, you're not going to have them going, wow, this sounds awful. Why did you do this? And you're sitting there thinking, oh, this sounds perfect. I couldn't possibly get this any better. I got started using a pair of KRK Rocket 5s, which I think they're like $150 a speaker, and I thought everything I was doing sounded great. And it turned out that the speakers were just really flattering to my mixes, and so when I took them to other facilities or other spaces, I was really surprised with how bad things sounded and how good it sounded in my room. So by getting something like these, I'm able to kind of compensate for that a little bit and get better translating mixes. 3 really important things when it comes to mix translation If you only ever mix in headphones, your stuff's never going to translate to actual speakers, so it's going to be kind of a challenge to get things sounding right. I would always recommend having at least a pair of speakers, even if it's just like computer speakers, just something to push a little bit of air. That's going to be a little bit more of an accurate representation of what your audio is actually doing, rather than just putting through headphones or, like in-ear monitors or something. I think those are some of the least accurate ways of listening in comparison to putting something up in a space. Second thing, headphones can really be super useful in situations like dialogue editorial when you want to clean up kind of the subtleties of sound. They're really good at, kind of disconnecting you from all of the other atmospheric sounds that you might get when you're cutting on a standard speaker system. I know a lot of dialogue editors who will cut their dialogue on headphones and then once they've finished their first pass, bring them up onto normal speakers and kind of get the rest of the bigger, broad strokes out of the way. Headphones can reveal a lot of problems that you wouldn't necessarily hear on larger speakers, so it's always really important to check your mixes on a real system as well as headphones. But the number one thing is just know how your system translates. So if you're able to critically listen to your system and find its strengths and find its weaknesses, get to understand those really well and how they translate to the rest of the systems that you might be playing stuff off of, that's going to be way more beneficial to you than just going and buying a random pair of speakers. So hopefully some of that information is helpful. I know this wasn't the most tangible thing of like, oh, just go buy this recorder or go pick up that pair of speakers and your mix is going to be perfect. It's more about how I approach solving the problems that I've got in my workflow when I need a new pair of speakers or when I want to pick up a new recorder or get a different microphone or whatever, how I approach those things. And that way you'll be able to make way more informed decisions and get the right stuff more effectively. Don't forget to comment below with any questions, hit like, hit subscribe, come follow me over on Instagram at AXK, and thanks for watching.